Rev your engines, folks. We're diving into the thrilling world of Formula One, the top-notch single-seater racing series that's revved up and ready to race. Since its establishment in 1950, F1 has come a long way. Can you believe it all started with front-engine cars? But fast forward to the 60s and we saw the introduction of the sleek mid-engine designs. And now we've got hybrid power units that are basically science fiction come to life. These cars are faster, safer, and packed with all the latest tech, making F1 the most exciting and competitive motorsport out there. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride as we take a look at how F1 has evolved over the years. 1950s. The 1950s saw F1 cars powered by a variety of engines, from custom-built inline fours to pre-war V8. The only regulations at the time were a limit on engine displacement 4.5 liters if naturally aspirated, and 1.5 liters if fitted with a supercharger. These engines produced around 425 horsepower, which translated to 94 horsepower per liter. However, in 1954, regulations were tightened, limiting engines to 2.5 liters and cutting power to 290 horsepower. Despite this, teams got creative with their engine layouts and managed to keep efficiency relatively high at 116 horsepower per liter. This decade saw a diverse range of engines, from inline 4s and 8s, V12 and 16, to even a V-twin. Although heavy, these engines were fitted at the front of the car, which resulted in a lot of understeer. Teams experimented with mid-mounted engines, such as the Cooper T43, which improved the balance by placing the center of gravity further back. Juan Manuel Fangio, who won an impressive 5 world championships in 7 seasons, dominated the F1 scene in the 1950s. 1960s. The FIA was concerned about the high speeds of F1 cars in the 1960s, which were reaching over 180 miles an hour on straights. With the complete lack of crash protection in the cars and barriers made of hay bales, the FIA limited engines to 1.5 liters. Although this initially resulted in lower horsepower, it soon increased to 250 horsepower over a couple of years. This meant that road cars and GT cars of the time were much faster than F1 cars. However, this forced teams to focus on suspension and aerodynamics, which resulted in faster lap times. The main engines used were V8, but teams experimented with wider V-angles to place the engine lower in the car for better handling. This was also the era where F1 first began using engines as stressed members, making the engine part of the chassis instead of simply bolting it on top. Ferrari was the first to do this after being inspired by Lancia. The 1960s were not without challenges, as the sport was still relatively dangerous and there were several fatal accidents during the decade. Despite this, drivers of the time were fearless and pushed their cars to the limits in pursuit of glory. This decade saw some of the most exciting and memorable moments in the history of F1, including the legendary battle between Jim Clark and Graham Hill at the 1965 Mexican Grand Prix. 1970s. In the 70s, they found a better way of creating a low-flat engine. They started playing with the idea of 180-degree V12, essentially making a flat 12. This allowed them to mount the engine low, bring the center of gravity down, and clean up the airflow to the rear wing. As aerodynamics became a bigger and bigger part of the sport, engine power became a bigger issue too as the cars began to produce much more drag. The regulations stayed pretty static through the 70s, with 3-liter naturally aspirated and 1.5-liter turbo engines allowed, and most of the teams were finding more success with naturally aspirated engines, until Renault came out with the 1.5-liter V6 in their RS1 in 1977, and it sparked off the incredible turbo era of F1. Initially, it produced 500 horsepower, but soon got up to around 700. It was a very experimental engine and it had some real issues. The incredible heat could cause some hot spots in the engine, and these had the potential to ignite the fuel prematurely and cause the engine to blow up, which was a fairly regular occurrence. So this was the point where F1 started using water injection to cool the block more evenly. Over the next few years, pretty much all the teams adopted a similar design, with some even beginning to use toluene to fuel the car. This exotic fuel combined with 5.5 bars of boost pressure meant that the cars could produce up to 1,400 horsepower for about 5 laps before blowing up, so the teams would turn boost up for qualifying and just replace the engine for the race. It did mean they had to turn down the engines to last a full race distance, so they produced around 800 horsepower. This power combined with the ground effect system sent speed through the roof, meaning the sport became much more dangerous, and they were also notoriously difficult to drive as the turbine provided all of the power in one lump. The 1970s saw some of the most exciting and memorable moments in the history of Formula One, including the legendary battles between Niki Lauda and James Hunt at the 1976 and 1977 seasons, and the emergence of Ferrari as a dominant force in the sport. These events helped to define the decade and set the stage for the sport we know and love today. 1980s. The cars of the 1980s were starting to resemble the high-tech machines we know today, and they were equipped with a wide range of advanced features such as electronic controls, carbon fiber composites, and advanced systems. This was also the era of ground effect cars, with Lotus 78 being the first one to introduce it. F1 went turbo-free in 1989. Where they introduced a 3.5-liter naturally aspirated engine. It divided the field massively as they all had to build entirely new engines to meet the new regulations. They all followed a V format, but disagreed on the correct number of cylinders. The Honda was the best of the bunch, producing around 675 horsepower from a V10. You will notice this is the first time to have a lower horsepower per liter figure than the last decade. However, turbos were banned, exotic fuels were banned, and there were tighter regulations on how long the engines had to last. However, the turbo era had taught the team some valuable lessons. They had been developing engine components that used exotic materials like titanium and beryllium. These were needed for the insane forces produced by the turbo engines. However, now they could be used to reduce weight and allow higher revs to make more power from a naturally aspirated engine. You typically need it to rev very high, but this comes with its own set of problems. Just think, as the engine revs faster, the valves also need to move faster, and the timing of this can get much tougher to control with a traditional camshaft system. So Honda used high-pressure air to move the valves with much more accuracy. This is called pneumatic valve control and is a system that is still used today. Towards the end of the 90s, the engines got up to around 800 horsepower, and we're back to producing similar power numbers to the turbo cars that came in the 80s. The 1980s saw some of the most exciting and memorable moments in the history of Formula One, including the legendary battles between Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, the emergence of McLaren as a dominant force in the sport, and the incredible speeds and technology on display at each race. 1990s. The cars of the 1990s were starting to incorporate even more advanced technologies, such as semi-automatic gearboxes, traction control systems, and improved aerodynamics. Teams were also using more sophisticated materials, such as carbon fiber composites, which helped to reduce the weight of the cars and increase their performance. The 90s also saw the emergence of Williams as a dominant force in the sport, and the incredible speeds and technology on display at each race. This was the era of greatest drivers of all time in Formula One. Names like Ayrton Senna, Alain Prost, Nigel Mansell, Michael Schumacher, Damon Hill, Jacques Villeneuve all raced in this decade. Man, I sure want to relive this era if I can. 2000s. The 2000s is when regulations were used extensively to control speed. From 1995, they used 3-liter naturally aspirated engines, as well as banning the exotic alloys that were extensively used in the 90s. The V10 was the formation that everyone landed on. It had similar power to the V12, but the reliability and lower fuel consumption of a V8. They produced around 900 horsepower, coming out to 300 horsepower per liter until in 2009, where KERS was introduced, Kinetic Energy Recovery System. It could regenerate energy from the rear brakes and deploy up to 80 horsepower for around 6 seconds a lap. It did come with a weight penalty though, so teams were fairly slow to adopt the system. However, it was really a test for 2014. Also, Michael Schumacher was the dominant force in his Ferrari from 2000 to 2004, winning 4 times in a row. This decade also saw the emergence of Lewis Hamilton as the future F1 champion as he won the 2008 championship. 2010s. Since 2014, the era in which Formula One has moved has been aptly named the Turbo Hybrid era, and it's fitting because it is the first time in the sport's history that hybrid technology has been merged with the internal combustion engine. These are essentially the rules we have today, 1.6-liter V6 engines with a single turbocharger. It came from a time where car manufacturers were producing more and more economical engines for their road cars, but still developing massive V8s for their F1 teams. So the FIA turned the team's attention to hybrid technology with the hope that it will trickle down to the road cars of the future. The cars have 2 regenerative systems, one harvesting energy from the turbo and one from the rear wheels during braking. This rear generator, called the MGUK, also doubles as a motor, forming the power units we have today. The motor and engines work together to produce around 1,000 horsepower. This is where the real efficiency of these engines show. They produce 625 horsepower per liter of displacement, more than any era of F1, and what's more amazing is that they do this whilst having having restrictions on fuel flow, rev limits, and the engines have to last a third of a season. The beginning of the decade was dominated with Vettel's impressive 4 championship wins, but after the 2014 regulation changes, Lewis Hamilton dominated the turbo hybrid era with his Mercedes car winning 7 world titles in the process and taking Mercedes to 8 world titles in a row from 2014 to 2021. 2020s. The 2021 season saw Max Verstappen end the long winning streak of Hamilton to become the world champion in the controversial Abu Dhabi GP. 2022 came with new regulations, new cars, new management, and a new budget cap system that revolutionized the sport as a whole. Since being banned in F1 from 1982, ground effect floors made its way back into the F1 with the new 2022 technical regulations, but with its return a major problem also made its way back into sport. The aerodynamic porpoising was the one thing that every team on the grid battled for the entire season. Mercedes in particular suffered the most. Take Azerbaijan GP as an example. But as the season progressed, all the teams made significant changes to their car's floor and other aero components and almost eliminated the porpoising effect. Red Bull along with Verstappen took the drivers' and constructors' title in the 2022 season. And now as we await the 2023 season starting in March, we all are eager to see if Mercedes can challenge Red Bull once again or stay in the midfield like last season. So that's all for the history of Formula One.